You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Naseem Ahmed and I will be your host for today's conversation. We have a very special guest today, someone whose work I've followed and admired for many, many years, someone whose journey as a journalist has been inspiring, to say the least, not just for me, for many, many others. I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to welcome to the show Peter Oborne to our conversation. Welcome to the show, Peter, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Naseem. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you. Peter, as many of you know, is a British journalist and broadcaster. He is the former chief political commentator of the Daily Telegraph, from which he resigned in 2015. He is the author of countless books, too many for me to list here. One of his recent volumes is The Assault on Truth, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, and the Emergence of a New Moral Barbarism. Peter has graciously joined our conversation to discuss his latest book, which is called The Fate of Abraham, Why the West is Wrong About Islam. I want to touch on something else, Peter, before we get to your book. Given the latest developments and the waves of resignations, I wanted to get your thoughts on this, Peter. You used to work with Boris Johnson. So I want to begin by getting your thoughts before diving in to the book. The two are not entirely unrelated, and I think they fit neatly into some of the broader themes of your work, which I will get to later on in the conversation. So begin, if you may, just giving us your thoughts on the Conservative Party and the waves of resignations.
Well, we're going through the final convulsions of Boris Johnson's time as Tory leader at the moment. He's certain to go. I think he'll probably be, could even go tonight. I don't think he'll last beyond tomorrow. And what we're seeing here is the collapse of, the Johnson project, which I think has to be understood as a far-right project, or authoritarian project, which had very inspired by the United States, by a number of think tanks drove it. Brexit was part of it, but it wasn't all of it. And one of the victims of the Johnson project, of course, were Muslims. We've seen the very ugly language used, bigoted language used by Mr. Johnson and many of his senior members of his team about Muslims and the way in which Muslims were treated within the Tory party. So it was I would say that Johnson was leading an attack on liberal democracy, the rule of law, freedom of speech, and Parliament itself. He was trying to have a presidential system of government. We've seen these sort of things emerging across the world. Donald Trump had a similar attack. Modi in India, who was a great ally and friend of Mr. Johnson, as we saw, he's been doing the same thing. And so, and this project, I don't know whether it's failed, because the reason why Johnson has gone or is about to go is because of his own moral failings, his lying, his deceit, his cronyism, his sleaze, and whether that he's replaced by somebody who just carries on the same project, or whether he something else better can take its place. We will see.
Yeah, that would be the question, is if Johnson is just the head of a project in its UK form, then simply changing the leader does not make any difference as far as British Muslims are concerned. The Conservative Party will still remain, as many Muslims would say, Islamophobic and bigoted when it comes to its Muslim citizens. That I suspect will remain the case. Johnson just brings in a more vulgar color to it. and
That's
dishonest
correct. But we will see, because I think the departure of Johnson does discredit the whole project, because it was embodied in an individual who turns out to be completely unfit for public office. And so people will want to re-examine it in the wake of this sensational moment. I mean, it's worth just adding that we've never had a prime minister ever who's left office in personal shame and disgrace, the way that Mr. Johnson is doing at the moment. He will be out very soon, I predict. He will leave office in shame and disgrace. This has never happened. We had a prime minister for 300 years in Britain, ever since Sir Robert Walpole in the 18th century. They've been driven out of office for failures of policy, but never for personal disgrace.
So let's turn to your book now. As I said, it does tie in with other themes which I will bring in later on from your other books, especially The Assault on Truth. So turning to your book, you mentioned that it had taken 20 years to write this. So tell us how you came to write the book. Tell us how it happened.
Yeah. Well, actually, funnily enough, I was, when I made the original decision I set out on the path which led to the writing of this book. I was working for Mr. Johnson. He was the editor of the Spectator magazine, and I was the political correspondent. It was after 9/11, and it was at the time of 7/7, the two terrible atrocities. But I noticed at the same time that there was a very ugly public discourse building up against Muslims in British newspapers, indeed in the Spectator, which I was working for. There's a lot which I found very vulgar, ugly, and sinister. And so I set out to investigate these false stories about Muslims. And I used to travel up and down Britain. I read in a hospital that Muslims are spreading disease. There's Muslim doctors at Leicester. I went to the University of Leicester where the doctors were. And of course, there's nothing in the story. That's a very medieval trope, isn't it?
Yes.
Often used against Jews, of course, in the Middle Ages. But this was about Muslims. And I went there, I invented it. It was something which had been twisted and distorted out of all context. It was totally untrue. I went to Manchester. There was a splash in the sun about a Kurdish refugee who'd fled Saddam Hussein, and he was apparently going to, the Sun said, blow up Manchester United football ground on match day. I went there. I found the refugee. I talked to him for an hour. He was just somebody who loved Britain, actually. He loved, Manchester United was his connection. He'd always supported Manchester United. And the police had investigated him, constructed this fake story. I apologized to him. He was traumatized. I never used his name. I talk about him in the book. I never used his name. It was so shaming that Britain had entertained a refugee and then put him through this. I said so to him. And there's so many other stories like that. It made me angry and upset.
Have you heard about the recent alleged miscarriage of justice regarding the conviction of 4 Muslims? I think a couple of years back. I think Cage is working on, he's produced a documentary on it. He's spoken to the lawyers, and they've published a documentary and saying that there has been a miscarriage of justice. There's enough evidence to suggest that this case should have been thrown away. So for the viewers here, have a look out for the documentary. It came out actually this week.
Can you tweet me about it afterwards? So
I think it's
I'd like to watch it. I went, having gone through the newspaper stories, then you go to the miscarriages of justice. I mean, the Trojan Horse affair, where as you know, the Birmingham schools, which
it's a chapter in your book, yes, Trojan Horse.
I devote a chapter. I interviewed Tahir Alam, the great teacher, great governor, who rescued these schools from being terrible schools. Gave real hope to thousands of children. Became one of the best schools in the country, and this is a school for people who've come from didn't have English as a first language. And then he was courtesy of Michael Gove, the education secretary, and the Tory government of the day, in alliance with the bigoted and rancid media. They targeted these teachers, destroyed their lives, wrecked the schools. It's a gross injustice, and that's I'll just look at this next miscarriage. These happen.
Yeah, I'll definitely send you that. I mean, there's been a lot of work on the Trojan horse, as you know, the New York Times podcast published a series on it, and
I watched that and I paid attention to it. Yes.
Going back to your book, just speaking broadly about its reception, have you been surprised by your former colleagues in the right-wing press and the British mainstream media in general? I can't imagine them appreciating being told, for all these years you've been wrong about Islam. And how has your reception been? Reception of your book?
Do you know what? I've been amazed. Do you know what? They've just ignored the book. There was one scratchy review in the Telegraph, and then nothing from the Murdoch press, nothing from the Telegraph press, apart from that one scratchy review. Associated newspapers, nothing. The BBC, nothing. Now, this is a book. This is a serious book. It goes into the
very serious book. Everyone has to read your book. It's an amazing book, and I cannot recommend it enough.
Now, if you look, I set out in great detail why the media, the politicians, the security services have been making terrible mistakes targeting a minority community. I don't say, by the way, that Muslims are beyond reproach or beyond criticism, quite the opposite. It's just that they're being targeted as Muslims for stupid, bad reasons. Now, nobody has corrected a single fact in my book. But, and I look at the way that Douglas Murray's book, The Attack on the West.
Europe. The Death of Europe.
Well, Strange Death of Europe. Look at the way Strange Death of Europe was received, which is essentially a domestication of the Great Replacement theory. Far right, dangerous stuff, which demonizes a whole category of immigrants to this country. Rapturous reviews, celebrated as a public intellectual. His most recent book about woke history or something is, again, 4 days of serialization in the Mail, a sort of groveling review. Well, it struck me as groveling review in the Sunday Times, and so on and so on. So but this far right stuff gets treated as something almost heroic, and certainly very important by the mainstream media in this country. Whereas my book, which gently rebuts the arguments of the strange death of Europe and shows how noxious they are, has been completely ignored. Now, doesn't that tell you something about the nature of mainstream discourse in this country?
Of course, they don't want to hear an opposing view, which questions the fundamentals of their belief and their views about Islam and Muslims.
I think this shows a new kind of discourse. I believe that 20 years ago in Britain, we had an idea that if somebody had a strong view and it was rejected or challenged, the other view would be heard too.
That's a very British value.
That is a British value which has been rejected by the mainstream media, of tolerance and fairness and free speech. I mean, of course, they bang on the right about free speech, but if they can close you down without even allowing you to be heard, there's nothing sort of, there's no law that makes that happen, but there's a sort of consensus, which means that views which are upsetting to the consensus somehow don't get heard at all.
So do you worry then that the mainstream and the public intellectuals we have at the moment, they are actually undermining the very traditional conservatism, which you support and you advocate for? So they're not really for religious tolerance, which the likes of Burke would propose. They don't want to hear an opposing view and give due care and fairness to people who, oppose their views. So do you worry that we've kind of debased truth and, dialogue in a way which traditional conservative values have been completely besmirched and undermined? Because you're a conservative, you feel very strongly about your values and principles, but are they the bigger threat to your values and principles, do you think?
Yeah, the new right, which Johnson, as we speak, is still Prime Minister, and he is the Prime Minister of the Conservative Party, is hostile to British values. It's very important to understand this. Deeply hostile to free speech, they're always attacking it. To Parliament, he's always trying to sideline it. And to the British tradition of religious liberty, which Burke, who you've just referenced, wrote about so powerfully. They're hostile to that. They want to impose a sort of coercive secularism on British society. It's one of the ways they target Muslims, but not just Muslims. They are hostile to religion generally, although I think because you're a minority Muslims, you get more hostility than other religious groups. But religious liberty is under threat. That's what the prevent strategy. There's lots of evidence of the prevent strategy going after people who take religion seriously. Now, I'm not saying that we all have to share other people's religious beliefs, but there's a huge tradition of religious tolerance which people struggled for centuries, which is now being rejected by this new secular movement, which has taken control at the heart of government. And I think one other thing is British values, which again is at the heart of the prevent strategy, has been, it's not a British idea. Until very recently, there was no such concept as
Stasi idea.
It is it is a bit, There was no concept of British values. We were decent. I think, it was live and let live. We always stood up at our best. And I know that Britain can be very severely criticized, but I love Britain. We stood up for the underdog. We were tolerant of eccentricity. We loved, we're freedom almost to the point of ridiculousness. All sorts of religious sects have flourished, or religions have been enabled. And the concept of British values, we never had to wave the flag. We were understated. They invented the idea of British values and imposed it after the Trojan Horse affair, basically to say to Muslims, as far as I can see, you're not British unless you absolutely sign up to a set of liberal values. So if you look at the definition of British values, it's liberal, it's coercive liberal values, and you're not allowed to be different from that. Now, have you noticed something that in Scotland they don't impose British values?
No.
In Northern Ireland they don't use British values. It's something they only use in England. And these guys, and it's imposed by this government, which is English National Party. They don't even know what British values are. They haven't the faintest idea. They're hostile to Britain.
Well, it's not just this government. Sorry to interrupt. It's not just government. Labour started it as well. So
Labour started.
There's a much broader, a wave of anti-Muslim hostility.
I was thinking about the use of British values in yes, that is true. Labour and Gordon Brown came up with, actually, I thought, quite a capacious idea of, when he was Prime Minister, he made a lovely speech which set out a very generous idea of British values, which I could recognise, which is that you can be Jewish and British, you can be Scottish and British, you can be black and British, you can be Muslim and British. It's a lovely, generous idea of British values, which means you can subscribe to your ethnic sort of background or honour your ethnic heritage and be British. You could be Muslim or Jewish or Christian or Buddhist or Hindu and be British. It wasn't this very narrow, tight, coercive liberalism, which now is supposed to represent British values. It doesn't. That's what I mean. Yeah.
No, and you touch on those issues in your book, and I think we can talk a lot about British values and the many ways in which this government is going wrong. I think we I want to bring the conversation back to the book itself, and especially the the subtitle, which is, why the West is wrong about Islam. So in the list of all the things the West has been wrong about Islam, what do you think is the main thing the West has been wrong about Islam? What is it about the West's view and perception of Islam that they've been the most wrong or dangerously wrong about?
Well, I go back, I have a historical section about tracing the relationship of the West and Islam back to the kind of First Crusade and below, where Islam is classified by Christian Europe in the Middle Ages as basically demonic or barbarous. And I visit the Council of Clermont, where the First Crusade was launched. It's not always the case, though, that the kind of demented ideas which drove the Crusaders were dominant. There's a wonderful moment under Tudor history when the greatest English monarch of all time, Elizabeth I, develops this lovely relationship very interesting relationship with Suleiman the lawgiver in
the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, and it's very interesting how they reach out to Muslim leaders, and Britain does have from the Elizabethan period onwards and until very recent times, quite a rich relationship with Islam. It's full of atrocities, mainly committed, I think, by the British, but also by the powers who Britain tried to attack or to rule over. But then America, I think, is a more difficult problem because essentially it's America. There is no such rich relationship. America, the Holy Bible structures the understanding of, it's the most read book in America, probably still today, but certainly for the first 300 years of its history. And they do see themselves, the Americans, very much after as a nation on a hill.
Yeah.
The blessed nation. They take a lot from the Old Testament, and in French, they see themselves, and those who are not the chosen people are barbarians. If you look at the history of Americans' manifest destiny, there is it's very interesting. And then the encounters come in war. First of all, against the Barbary pirates, which happens immediately after the Declaration of Independence, where British sea power is no longer available to protect American shipping. You have this proto clash of civilizations, or so many echoes of antecedents to what was going to come 200 or 300 years later with the invasion of Iraq and so forth.
So you mentioned the clash of civilizations. That's obviously a very recent concept and framing of West relationship with the Muslim world. When did that policy shift take place? When they spoke about the clash of civilizations, Huntington's clash of civilizations, when did that start to take shape in your view, and completely derail some of the positive aspects of the relationships with Islam and the Muslim world, which you take, I think, 3 chapters to unpack? Most of your book really is a really rich historical account of US's history with Islam and the Muslim world, the British history with the Islam Muslim world, and the French one, which is a lot more violent. And I think all their past relationship with the Muslim world has shaped current policies.
Very much
but it seems like there was a period in history where every single Western country, the 3 I just mentioned, their prism and their way of looking at the Muslim world was through the lens of a clash of civilization. Samuel Huntington. When did that take place?
I mean, if you look at the British, I've suggested that the British Empire, you can criticize it for all sorts of reasons, but it didn't seek to say, you've got to be like us. There's Western civilization, you've got to join it. Very happy for people to go to mosque or to pray however they wished. The Americans, I think mainly is defined by ignorance. And I think they're shaped very deeply by their experience with native Indians who they saw as savages. They're really there to be attacked, to be ethnically cleansed, and to have, they don't have any rights. France is very different, and it's quite telling, and it's tragic, which is that France invades Algeria, and it is a process. It's a seizure of land, which the British tended, with few exceptions, not to do. So the British in India never sought to take the land, and that made it a much less violent relationship. Look at, with certain notable exceptions, such as the first Indian War of Independence, what the British called the Mutiny. And but the French, they went to North Africa, they seized the land, terrible ethnic cleansing, atrocities committed by the French as they did that, and then the very bloodthirsty War of Independence, which followed after World War II. And the French conception was that you either were outside you were not allowed in, you were uncivilized, or you became French. You just had to essentially deny that you were a Muslim, or be very private about it. You had to acknowledge the Republic and the values of the Republic. And Macron is simply is another manifestation of that in France today, where Muslim identity is attacked and denied. And that is exactly what the French have been doing since the invasion of Algeria in 1830.
Speak a little about the title itself, The Fate of Abraham. I mean, the book provides a really long historical account, current government policies. Where does the idea of the Abrahamic faith come into this? Well, why this grandiose title? Are you trying to oppose the idea of simply a Judeo-Christian civilization, and you see a more broader civilization which includes Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, the three Abrahamic faith? So speak a little bit about that, and what do you envisage with that title?
Well, when if I travel around the Middle East and you go to a Christian church, and you go in and you will hear the term Allah Jamil from a Christian preacher. You go to a mosque, you'll hear exactly the same term in Arabic, Allah Jamil, God is beautiful. We worship the same God as the Jewish God. We all worship the same. And the three great monotheistic Middle Eastern religions all worship the same God. It's a very important point. And if you read the Quran, which I've increasingly been doing,
Christian Arabs use Allah when they speak about God.
Allah. Yeah, it's the same phrase. Whereas often if you read in Western newspapers, Allah is a sort of menacing thing. It's our God. We share the same God. And I find it, I think this is very important. We're much more, the three great religions, monotheistic religions, are very similar. Read the Quran. It's what it says about Jesus. There's more about Jesus' mother Mary in the Quran than there is in the Bible. And the ethical structures are very similar. And the prophets had enormous respect for Jesus and Mary and all the Jewish prophets. And so I think we have so much. I do think that the people of the book, which is the phrase Islam uses,
Al-Kitab.
Al-Kitab, is a better phrase. I understand why Judeo-Christian tradition emerged. It emerged in the 30s, in part, and it emerged because Christianity had been anti-Semitic from the start, almost. And and then there have been, you go through the pogroms, you go through Martin Luther's lethal anti-Semitism, and it culminates in the Nazis. And intellectuals and theologians in the 1930s are having to say the Judeo-Christian tradition in order to bring in as the terrible that the Holocaust is beginning to be seeded. But after World War II, the necessity for that particular phrase went away. But it was used against the communism, and then it's used against Muslims. It's used as if you look at, I studied the history of this, or the contemporary history of this, it's now used by far-right groups against Muslims. They're attacking our Judeo-Christian tradition. You know, if you look at Bannon, Trump's ideologist, has got a center of Judeo-Christian sort of thought. You know, on the French right, they're now using this term, Judeo-Christian, not to be inclusive, which is what it should be, but to be exclusive, to exclude one of the great Abrahamic religions. That is why I felt Fate of Abraham was a meaningful title for the book.
I've always wondered, you know, it's not solely Christian civilization, but European civilization pushed its Jewish citizens to the brink of extinction. Nevertheless, they've managed to overcome that and see themselves as a unified civilization, despite the persecution of Judaism and Jews through the centuries. So why is such a strong leap to be more gracious and accommodate Islam as also part of that civilization? I mean, scholarly, there have been some professors, like, for example, I think Richard Bulliett, who he's got a book called The Case for a Judeo-Christian Islamic Civilization. Richard, American. So you're in good company. You're in good company. You know, there are people who are advocating the idea. Essentially, if you can have a Judeo-Christian, I don't think it's a huge leap to say that Islam is part of that, given the historical connection in Spain, Andalusia, and also through the Crusades. You know, Islam.
Wonderful periods of European history when in Andalusia, where religious tolerance was practiced. But also, there's another thing which I point about the Judeo-Christian tradition, which I think is troublesome, which is actually, if you look at the intellectual history of Europe and the theological history of Europe, all kinds of other influences from the ancient Greeks to modern secularism, feminism, which have nothing to do, liberalism, which have little or nothing to do with the Judeo-Christian, the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament tradition. And actually, particularly in the last 50 to 100 years, we've got new traditions emerging, a sort of militant secularism, which are in fact hostile to the Judeo-Christian tradition and to Muslims and to Islam. And in fact, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity have far more in common. They're fighting a common battle against coercive liberalism or secularism, and standing up for sort of religious liberty against this dominant secular state. And so really there is a further reason for trying to link the three religions.
Yeah, and I think
you often see this in cross-faith groups. You know, they know what they're doing. You know, there's Jewish Muslims groups, there are Jewish Christian groups, Christian Muslim groups, and so on. And they are clearly fighting the same battle for traditional values in a society which is modernizing very fast.
And I think there is a natural ally there against extremist secularism. But I want to swiftly move on because I am conscious of the time and go really to the meat of your book, which brings the history to the contemporary period, which looks at the Cold War in Islam. I mean, as you said, the book's separated into three. The first three parts is the history, and then you look at the Cold War. If I can put that into context, the former USSR was defeated. And many of the characters, groups, organizations, and think tanks, for example, Policy Exchange, which appears in your book, that was set up to accelerate the downfall of the Soviet Union, turned their attention and focus to the new foe, which is Islam and the Muslims, and they use the same propaganda tools. So tell us a bit about the new Cold War in Islam that's taken shape, and who are the main characters?
I didn't quite say a Policy Exchange, which is
no, you didn't say
that they were set up in early 21st century, but they were. What I argue is that they looked back, and organizations like policy exchange. They look back to the security architecture set up at the end of the Cold War after 1945 to deal with the threat of Soviet communism. And so when after 9/11, the policymakers and intellectuals set up felt there needed to be a security architecture to deal with Muslims. And in order to work out how to do this, they went back to the immediate years after 1945, when the CIA and other intelligence services set up a huge secret network of civil society organizations, which were secretly, covertly guided by the United States government or the British government, in order to manipulate and control the left. And it made a division in the left between those who were acceptable leftists or socialists and those who were communists. And many intellectuals were part of this. The most famous case in Britain is probably Encounter magazine, which projected itself under some of the most dominant intellectuals of the time as this very sort of left-wing magazine, but actually it was all the time controlled by the CIA and MI6. And they're very consciously, there's a very good book which I drew on by somebody called Francis Stoner Saunders, who explains this process. And very conscious, this book was very important in creating the security architecture post, particularly after 7/7. And I show how they did it, and I show the use of the same covert strategies. I look at things like the Quilliam Foundation, which actually wasn't covert, but it was set up by the British state with the aid of the British state in order to create this idea of the moderates, a Muslim. I give a history of the Quilliam Foundation. We also get and how it sort of ends up rather farcically, I would say, a few years ago. And the same McCarthyism which evolved after 1945 in the States. I have a look at that, and then you can show that Muslims in Britain, not violent Muslims or sort of dangerous people, but people who have the wrong political view, Islamists, normally they're labeled, get put on secret lists, get excluded from public discourse, and so on. I show, and I make the analogies. They're quite sharp analogies. They're very similar. And the final thing I say is, look, in 1945 onwards, with the rise of Soviet Russia, there was a genuine threat to the West by a genuine danger, Soviet Russia, which threatened the values of the West. There's no Muslim countries which are at war with the West. I mean, they don't pose a threat. And to categorize millions of your and my fellow citizens as somehow subversive or dangerous is is something which I'm strongly against. I think it is very un-British.
It's a path of totalitarianism, isn't it?
It is very much, and I'm afraid that it may be about to get worse with the publication of the Shawcross review of the Prevent strategy. One hears the most alarming things about that.
That's right. It wants to refocus its attention on Muslims and not far-right extremists. Yes, that should be coming out soon. I want to ask one last question and return back to Boris. As you mentioned at the beginning, Boris is a phenomenon in the sense that he's not simply an individual. He's part of a movement which saw Trump and the general toxicity within our politics, degeneration of politics. You have a book called The Rise of Political Lying as well. So in some ways, some would argue that this is chicken coming home to roost, having toxified politics, culture, society to advance the so-called war on terror directed at Muslims. Some would say, is it any wonder we have the likes of Johnson, the likes of Trump, and a general war on truth, when truth is when lie is normalized in the fight against Islam or Islamism, as they would say. why should we accept anything else other than figures like Trump, figures like Johnson, and the general debasement of politics?
I agree with this entirely. One of the ways that Johnson has been trying to save his skin in recent months is to develop a whole series of what political experts call wedge issues. These are the right-wing ideas which are inserted into public debate and split people off, and they always shift you towards the right. And I'm very afraid that the next wedge issue, which culture war, that the Conservatives will want to fight, either under Johnson or probably when he's gone, but they were planning it. You can see the next one is the Shawcross report and the prevent strategy and the further securitization of British Muslims. And based on ignorance, by the way.
Just for our viewers, sorry, Peter. I think Rwanda was the last wedge issue.
Yeah, and that's for Rwanda was a terrible moment.
Yeah, that was a wedge issue.
Terrible moment where you get the question of asylum seekers and you politicize it, and you show you're ready to basically discard every value which Western civilization claims is its own, to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda, which has been the site of a recent genocide and where human rights are still very precarious. And it's a deliberate strategy to embarrass Starmer, the Labour Party, because they'll say, what else are you going to do with immigrants? And so immigration has always been a right-wing issue. It's not going to work, but that doesn't even really matter, because politically it creates a dividing line between Labour and the Conservatives, and it's for people who don't understand the issues very well, it's popular.
Thank you, Peter. And we have come to the end of our time. It's been really fantastic having you on our show. So for those the viewers at home watching, get the book. It's a fantastic book, quite chunky, but a lot of history, and also connects the current war on terror and hostility towards Islam, Prevent, Trojan Horse, Kolyam, so many other things with in a way which is very unique and very enjoyable to read.
I did try and make it very readable, so that
it's very readable. It's not an academic book. It's very, very readable, as you'd expect from a journalist like yourself, came journalist like yourself. So thank you again, and I want to thank our viewers at home as well for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. See you again for another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.